Archie Shepp.
You've been at Amherst for quite some time now.
Well, now about 15 years, yeah.
Describe a little bit what motivated you to leave the New York performing scene, the avant-garde New York performing scene at that time, and go to Amherst.
Well, mostly it was my family, my immediate family, meaning my wife and children, and then my mother, who's now deceased, who encouraged me to get out of the city and try to own something, some property. So I did. I live on a farm, too. I suppose most of us ghetto guys opt for farms when we get out of the city.
Wide open.
Yeah, the wide open spaces.
You say you're a city boy. Describe your early years to us.
Well, I was born in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and raised there for the first 7 years or so of my life, and grew up in Philadelphia. I spent my formative years there. So I do count myself an urban person. Even Fort Lauderdale wasn't really, you might say, the sticks, in the sense that you think of southern towns as being country. The city is a tough place, especially for, I think, minority people. I grew up in a place that is known as the Brickyard. In fact, it had been a brickyard when the Irish lived there originally, and then they moved out, and the Italians moved in, and then the black folks started moving in the 40s, which is about the time we came along. And it still carries that name today. In fact, it's not called the Brickyard, it's called simply Brickyard, without the article. And as its name implies, it was a very stoic, Spartan upbringing. I was fortunate. I was raised pretty much as an only child. My brothers and sisters didn't come until later. In fact, I'm 15 years older than my oldest sister. So perhaps it's one of the reasons I was able to enjoy some of the benefits of simply growing up. I mean, piano lessons, music lessons, and I was a good reader all through school because my aunt and grandmother spent a lot of time with me, teaching me my alphabet and reading to me and so on. So from an academic standpoint and a cultural standpoint, perhaps I enjoyed things that many of my peers did not. And even my sisters and brothers who came after me, I think, found it a bit tougher. But the ghetto life, in quotes, was important to me because it taught me the elements, I suppose, of survival. And it deepened my sensitivity and my compassion. Many of my friends are dead. I feel as though I have come through a war, though I never went to Vietnam.
At what point did music, and specifically the saxophone, become your ally and or a weapon with which to deal with this war?
Well, I started out on piano at a very early age. As I say, my parents provided me with music lessons, and I was very fortunate. I think I was about 10 years old, and then I studied the clarinet from about the age of 13 to when I was 15, and then at the age of 15, my grandmother and my aunt purchased a saxophone for me, and I probably studied the saxophone less formally than the piano in a way. So the bulk of my lessons were on clarinet and piano.
I, of course, like so many other people, became aware of you as an individual through your work. Your first record that I was aware of was the album called Four for Train. And there was a picture on that album of you sitting on the steps, and I believe you had a pipe you were smoking.
Right.
And behind you is John Coltrane looking down at you. And the music was dedicated to John Coltrane.
I was very fortunate to have met John Coltrane as a young man, and I was among a number of young people in whom he took an active interest, and he was perhaps essential to my making the first recording I did for Impulse Records. I must say that Bob Thiel, who later became quite an aficionado of this kind of music, really couldn't stand that kind of music when he first heard it, and he was very suspicious of my motives. I used to call him every day on the phone, and his secretary would tell me, either Bob is out to lunch or he's at a meeting, you know. This went on for a few months. I was on welfare. I used to take 10 dimes out of my welfare check a day. I was on a fifth-floor walk-up in New York, and I'd run down to the telephone, the drugstore phone in the corner, And I'd call 10 times each day. And I put aside $1 a day to call Bob Thiel. And for over a month, I would get this answer: Bob just left, or he's out to lunch, or he's in a meeting. And so it was Bill Dixon who suggested to me that I asked John directly to intercede. And I was very humble about that kind of thing, and I didn't want to put myself on John or to take advantage of what I felt was an acquaintance. I can't really say a friendship in that sense, because I didn't really know him perhaps as well as he might have known me at the time. I think that always accrues in a relationship between an older and a younger person, because I found out later he probably thought a lot more of me than I thought he did. So I asked him, and he was working that night down at the Half Note when I asked him, down on Spring Street, and it was on the intermission. And I hemmed and hawed, I didn't quite know how to get it out. I wanted him to intercede from his record date. So finally he says, "Well, what are you trying to say, Shepp?" He says to me, So I said, "Well, John, I want you to ask Bob Thiel to give me a record date." So he looked at me very hard, and then I thought, "Oh God, I've done it," and he says, "People are always taking advantage of me." He says, "Because they think I'm easy." And he looked at me very hard, and then he says, "Well, I'll see what I can do." And the next day I called Bob, and lo and behold, I spoke to himself, And he says, "Yeah," he says, "Well, John told me about it," and he says, "The only problem is," he says, "you can't," because this is the way he used to sort of brush off all the young guys, the avant-garde players, because Coltrane had interceded before for other people. Well, this is the way Bob usually got them off his back. He would say, "Well, you can't record your own music. You'll have to record all of Coltrane's music." But I knew about this little gimmick, and I had been really actively rehearsing my band. In fact, I had arranged the songs already. I said, "Great." So this is how we did the 4 for Train date, and of course 4 of the compositions were John's. And Bob was really upset at the record date, because I think he felt that John had forced him into something he really didn't want to do, and he was smoking his pipe like a chimney in the corner there at Rudy Van Gelder's, and he didn't even turn around to look at us as we were warming up. But after the first song, he got on the phone and he called John out in Long Island. He said, "Train," he said, "this stuff is great." So he says, "You got to come out." It was 11 o'clock at night. So John, being the gracious man he was, came out without even his socks on. And in fact, on the album, you'll see he has no socks on. And he sort of oversaw my first recording for Impulse. And after we finished the 4th song, there was one original piece I had written, which was called Rufus.
Yes.
Swung his back at last to the wind, and then his neck snapped.
Yes.
Parenthesis. And of course, this is one of the songs that Bob thought we should never include in the album, and he wanted John to hear this because it was just enough to fill out the album. We needed that much time. It wasn't a very long piece. And it was the only, you might say, piece from the album that fit the avant-garde description, and certainly the one that I was later to be titled with. So he says, "John, listen to this piece." He says, "I don't like it very much." He said, "And tell me what you think." So Train listened to Rufus, and he very tentatively, and after the piece was over, he said, "Well, I like it, Bob. I think you ought to leave it in." So Bob says, you like it, really?" Mm-hmm. So because of John, that one piece was left in. And I think it was important, too, because that was ultimately an original piece by myself, and it served to underscore some of my own originality. Once again, and I say it very humbly, without Mr. Coltrane, this would not have been possible at all.
This track you mentioned, Rufus, if I'm not mistaken, was unique also in that it had some actual vocal aspects to it.
Yes.
You had an intellectual identity as well as an artistic identity at that point. I suspect it was from that posture and that part of the presentation that I and many others realized that there was something new operating here that we hadn't seen before, not just musically but conceptually. Here was a young jazz musician who had a larger agenda to get across.
In order to get something across to people, sometimes musical notes are not enough. sometimes we have to say these things in words. And I think it's been borne out by the kind of music we hear today, which is more and more vocal music and less instrumental. There is that need, I think, especially on the part of our 2000-year-one audience, to have that verbal communication, the vernacular.
You've been doing this kind of thing for a long time. I remember the track Mama Too Tight.
Right.
Inside and outside.
Yeah.
James Brown meets...
Glad you mentioned that name. I think he's a really important person, regardless of style or type of music. I think he's changed the way soul music is played today and rock and roll music, especially the backgrounds, double timing the figures against the drum beat and so on. He and Ray Charles, I think, were very important. Ray for bringing in the sort of the gospel element, for introducing that, and Brown reinforced that element and also introduced a rhythmic element, which one of my fantasies is to have heard James Brown and John Coltrane together.
Mine also.
Because I think we would have found a nexus there that hasn't quite been forged yet.
And I can hear you and your music going toward that from time to time.
Yeah.
Also, it seems to me, almost as it's more than a footnote, but as a commentary on the kind of blue note dance records that were coming out in the mid to late 60s that were really using a backbeat, but in a real twist commercial way, and it didn't have the real thing. I mean, your use of it and some other so-called avant-garde uses of that R&B feel were very pure, and it's where the primitive meets the avant-garde or something.
Yeah, I think so, and I must say that I was very influenced by Lee Morgan's recording of the Sidewinder. Lee was very influential to me growing up. I'm just a year older than he is, or he was, and he was quite a mentor to me during those years. I used to comp piano backgrounds for him when he was growing up as a youngster, and usually because he couldn't find a real piano player. But it helped me a lot. It helped me to learn to play the piano.
Really?
So on Saturday afternoons, I used to go to his mother's house, and very often I'd either bring some music or play some music. He had things like Sippin' at Bells or Tempest Fugit, where I'd play the chords just straight up, from the root. But eventually I learned to voice that way. And Lee was very helpful to me on the saxophone in that he led me to identify solos and to learn how to play, you might say, notes against the chords. Piano players are very fortunate in that when they look at the piano, they can see what they're doing. But horn players have to do all that from the mind, you might say. They have to envisage what they're actually playing. So by learning to play to back up horn players on the piano, I eventually began to get a concept on the saxophone, which you might say is a piano concept, much more so than a saxophonic one.
Really?
Yeah.
You mean in your choice of notes specifically?
Oh, definitely. The saxophone keyboard, as much like I would see a piano keyboard, because I can visualize it. I think that's an advantage to me in a way. It can be a disadvantage because you play too many notes sometimes. And so that's a thing I've been getting into, as Miles says, learning to edit myself. But it's because sometimes I think I see perhaps too much, and it's a question of distilling. But it's been very helpful to me, my knowledge of the piano over the years, and it has profoundly influenced my concept on the saxophone.
That surprises me because your tone is such a highly vocalized tone. I would have assumed that you approach the saxophone from the human voice point of view and were finding ways to turn it loose. And yet you've told me that the way you chose was through the traditional keyboard.
Yes, indeed. I don't think you're altogether wrong about that, though, because before I began to meld these two concepts, I certainly went through a period where the melody of the saxophone and my approach to the saxophone was certainly more melodic than harmonic. It was after my meeting with Coltrane and because of his influence and others, Golson, Lucky Thompson, that I began to think of different ways to play chords so that I could get to as many notes as possible. Now I'm in the reverse side of it. I'm trying to play perhaps as few notes as possible, but that certainly was helpful to my technique. You mentioned those Blue Note recordings. Many of them were sort of formularized because I think Alfred I used to dictate that all the bands had to sound like Horace Silver and Art Blakey because they were the best sellers on his label. So a lot of the Blue Note compositions from that period sound very similarly, at least in terms of the format, the way the band is organized and arranged. But what's so amazing about it is that so many great musicians came through that stable, guys like Billy Higgins and Lee Morgan and Roy Brooks, Freddie Hubbard. I mean, those recordings were very influential to me, as well as I'm sure to many musicians. It's interesting that they sold their entire catalog eventually to the Japanese. Mm-hmm. In fact, I had been very enamored of Horace's compositions for quite a while. I think he's one of the important composers out of that period. I couldn't find that record, and I didn't find it until the first time I went to Japan. And when I went back again, I recorded the record, but...
Eventually, of course, they'll all come out here. I get the feeling that we're being colonized with our own culture, from Japan now. And there's a kind of an irony in there for us.
Well, it serves us right, huh?
Yeah, it does serve us right.
Yeah, Admiral Perry and all those guys notwithstanding.
Welcome home.
Yeah.
The idea of Horace Silver being one of our important composers, I think, is part and parcel of the idea that what makes jazz truly America's only native art form is that it does have a long history and a deep repertoire that people have to be made aware of, and Horace Silver fits into that repertoire.
Oh, yeah.
When you take somebody like Horace Silver and you treat him your own way, you're breathing new life into Horace, but you're also breathing new life into yourself, aren't you?
Oh, for sure. And I think most musicians have... in the back of their mind, some guy that they always wanted to play with, play music with. And Horace is one of those guys, one of those bands that I always wanted to be in the 50s and 60s when my formative period for music was the 60s. And when a lot of his important things were coming out, Senior Blues, and gee, I envied the hell out of Junior Cook and those guys for the fact that they were able to be there. Not that they weren't much more, I feel it, certainly at that time, ready to be there. I had just come out of college, and though I knew my changes, as they say, I didn't have the experience. I learned that from the sessions at Basie's. I used to be at the sessions with Richard Williams and John Handy and Freddie and all those guys before they joined the bands. And they were a little ahead of me then because, as a college boy, I just couldn't put all the time into my horn that I wanted to, and those guys were playing pretty much 24 hours a day. They were playing the music. So when I'd come home in the summers, I'd come to New York and stay with my aunt. I used to go up to the sessions at Basie's. I went home many a night discouraged, because those guys were playing so much music.
We started with a discussion of you at the very edge of the avant-garde, so-called. That's how you were portrayed in the 60s. And to the point where the record companies had real concerns about whether they should record your music at all.
Even now.
Even now, perhaps. Set aside as an avant-garde player, that's kind of a way to dispense with a musician, isn't it? By calling somebody an avant-garde player, that sort of puts him over to the side.
It confuses people when we start saying jazz, soul, bebop, blues. Sounds like gobbledygook. And I think I was reading recently where Dizzy Burks Gillespie had been warned by Ellington not to let the critics call his music bebop because if you name it, you date it. I think that's a very profound insight. It implies something of the your work, the Black Talk book, in which language means so much outside of even in the way we categorize phenomena, so that. Given all the other problems that Negro music faces here in the United States, that's just another problem heaped onto it. That is, when you label it, and it's labeled something that nobody understands. For jazz itself, as I often tell my classes, has as many social meanings as it has cultural and musical ones. It's not like when we say Baroque or classical or Renaissance. Those things have very specific and definite meanings. But when we describe the phenomena that attempts to portray the cultural perceptions of minority people, especially Negroes. It seems that our language goes haywire. And when we try to put that in an academic context, I mean, for example, when you want to teach people what it is.
Yes.
Recently, I gave my students an assignment for a term paper, and they were asked to talk about gospel music or jazz music or soul. They could choose what they wanted. I was just so amazed by their confusion when it comes to describing what this music really is, except for very few people who, in some cases, are musicians. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult for the layperson to articulate what it is they're listening to.
You talk about the interrelationship between all the various black idioms, whether it's gospel or blues or jazz or soul, and one of the things that all those idioms have in common is the highly vocalized tone. And anybody who puts on an Archie Shepp record, whether it's an old one or a brand new one, is immediately struck by the vocalized tone. If they put on one of your records on the Varick label, they're also going to be struck by your actual vocalizing. You sing the song, The Good Life. I like that vocal, Archie. It's dedicated to the memory of Sonny Stitt. The vocalized tone brought all the way home. What brought you to record this song in this way?
Well, once again, I was doing a performance at Joe Siegel's Jazz Showcase in Chicago before Sonny Stitt died. And I happened to see Von Freeman, the father of Chico Freeman, who's a very fine saxophonist. And when I met Von, it was the second time. I'd met him for the first time at the North Sea Festival in Europe. But this was the second time I'd actually met him and talked to him. And he says, Sonny Stitt was just out here. And just before Sonny died, and he says, Sonny was playing The Good Life. And so he said he laughed in a very wry way, and he says, I asked Sonny, how could he possibly feel like that? And of course, a few months later, Sonny was dead. But he told me the story before Sonny passed away, and I am such a fan of Sonny Stitt's, and I've listened to so many of his recordings, that I could almost hear him playing the record. And Sonny, like Billie Holiday, had very good taste in the material he chose to play. Speaking of the vocality of these things, he often chose songs that had vocal implication. Some people might consider that a very banal melody sung by Tony Bennett, but it has a tremendous message if you listen to the inside of it. And I could just hear Sonny playing it with all the depth and imagination and technique that he would bring to it. Mm-hmm. And so I thought about playing it myself, and I said, well, gee, maybe I'll never rise to that occasion. Maybe I should sing it. This is my chance to sing. So I decided to sing it and dedicate it to Sonny, whom I never heard play it, but in my mind's heart, I heard him play it.
It again reminds me that jazz music, even in its most abstract and historical context, is essentially popular music when it's at its best.
It's very important, and it was one of the reasons why I began to try to fit my materials more to, you might say, popular taste. And by popular taste, I mean I wanted to attract a wider audience, because I feel audiences should have some alternative to rock and roll. I think musicians, especially those who come from my kind of background, should think twice and more than that when they play for people, that today's audience is not as sophisticated as the audiences of the 60s, at least from a listening point of view. They couldn't possibly be, because they don't hear the same things. When we grew up, radio was perhaps the overriding medium. You didn't see what you heard, so your mind's eye had to fashion the picture, and your ears were bigger. The things we heard were more complicated. Kate Smith would never have made it today, not because she couldn't sing in tune, but because she was fat. Jazz musicians didn't have to look good. Rock and roll musicians have to. I tell my kids this is, probably the thing that militates mostly against my becoming a rock musician is my image, that I'm getting too old for it. I mean, guys like me. I even say that of people like Miles. I find it embarrassing at times that 60-year-old men have to act like 20-year-old boys. it's a tragedy that such a gifted musician can't live out his life on his own merits and on his own terms, that suddenly, in order to be successful, whatever that means, or to make millions of dollars, whatever that means, you have to become something else, put on high-heel shoes or loosen your tie or whatever. Some of these things seem so superficial when we look at them, but the world has changed so dramatically from the time that I first heard Coltrane with Miles to the time I heard, say, Branford Marsalis with Miles.
And I also think that the technology has come home to roost.
Yes, hasn't it been?
And technology really determines what music sounds like in a very basic way.
Doesn't it? Yeah.
So the human scale, Coltrane was magnificent music on a human scale.
Yeah, yeah.
And it wasn't about technology, it was about a great human spirit.
Of course, and I think one thing that underscores that, I remember hearing John here at the East Village Inn, it was that at the time, and later it was taken over by Billy Graham. It became Fillmore East on 2nd Avenue, and I used to live right around the corner. So I went there one evening to hear Coltrane, and he had what they call the Young Turks, all the young players, who were really hammering out the music. And I was sitting right up front, and I could see Train bending and blowing hard, but I could hardly hear anything. Of course, I knew his music, and I could feel the vibe. And I remember coming back a few weeks later when Billy Graham took over the place. Mm-hmm. And he'd completely outfitted it with a new sound system and everything. And I went to hear Charles Lloyd. Of course, the night I went to hear John with his group, the place was almost empty.
Yeah.
But this night, I went to hear Charles. The place was packed. And I stood at the back of the auditorium. It was one of the old Lowe's theaters, so it was a huge place. Held 2,000-3,000 people. I was standing at the back of the theater. Charles was playing a flute solo, which was coming in clear as a bell, and the bass player was louder than he was. And I thought back to when I'd heard Coltrane with these 7 or 8 young players blowing their guts out, and you couldn't hear them in the first row. So getting back to the technology of it all, yes, times have changed. Today, I think we're much more visually oriented. I think of my presentations as partly dramatic today, and my acting training, all that comes in very handy for me, because today the people don't come to hear, they come to see. So I've added that to my performance. I spend as much time with visual events, from the way I dress, from the way my behavior on stage, as with musical ones, because of course your musical practice takes place at home anyway. Mm-hmm. So, but the audience today is much more demanding. They demand a visual experience. They demand a happening.